If you're thinking of upgrading the suspension bushes on your car, then this is the video for you. In this video, we're going to be going over everything you need to know about suspension bushes. Upgrading the suspension bushes on your car can be a really effective upgrade, but it is one you do need to be careful with. The wrong bushes can ruin the handling of the car out on the roads, whilst carefully selected bushes can transform the handling of the car without taking too much away in terms of comfort. Today we're going to be upgrading the suspension bush in our front lower control arm with one of our solid front control arm bushes and going through some of the benefits of that upgrade as well as some of the downsides of the wrongly selected bushes throughout the car in general. For those of you new to the channel, what we're aiming to achieve is we're taking our standard BMW F80 M3 all the way from a stock road car up to a track weapon. We're doing each upgrade one by one, and we're data logging the difference that each upgrade makes individually to show you the difference it makes over the chassis. So we're going to get the car up in the air now and show you why we want to upgrade the bushes on this car. So the front suspension assembly on the F80 M3, it shares a similar design to the majority of BMWs, and that is a McPherson strut suspension assembly. So the damper and spring assembly controls the top of the hub, and at the bottom we've got these three suspension components linking the hub to the chassis. We've got our lateral control arm, we've got our thrust arm, and we've got our tie rod assembly, which controls the steering. So we're interested in the lateral arm and the thrust arm in particular, as they take a lot of the loads that the car experiences out on track and out on the road. The lateral arm takes a lot of the lateral forces, as you might expect, which is the cornering forces through the chassis. So the forces moving left to right, pushing and pulling as we go through that corner on this arm. And this arm actually has a solid bush as standard on the F8X M cars. So BMW know the importance of reducing the flex as much as possible in the suspension system to optimize performance. The arm we're really interested in though is the forward thrust arm. So this is the arm here that goes forward in the chassis, and that's responsible for the longitudinal forces through the front suspension assembly. So that's the forces under really heavy braking and also on throttle as well as we're pushing the chassis forward. So we've taken one of the thrust arms off the car, which is here, and as you can see, it's got a very big rubber bush in the front suspension system here. So under really heavy braking, this allows the arm to flex and move because of all of the movement available in this rubber bush. This means that geometry changes occur to the car under heavy braking, and also as we're going through the corner and applying some lateral load to this bush, it also flexes and pushes and pulls the hub. So we can put the best settings on this car for track use, for road use, but as soon as we start using the car dynamically with bushes like this in that allow a lot of flex in a certain aspect of the suspension, it actually allows for those geometry angles to change on the movement. So as we're going through the corner, our toe settings are physically changing, as are our camber settings, and as we're on really heavy brakes, the toe is getting knocked out quite substantially, and that's actually shown in this chassis out on track, where in a really heavy braking zone on track, we've got a lot of force going through the front tyres, flexing this bush substantially. You actually feel the wheels start to weave around a little bit, and that is the movement in this bush, allowing that toe change to occur. So this is a bush we're very interested in upgrading, so we're going to take a look at some of the options for upgrading this bush. When we're looking to upgrade the suspension bushes, there's a few different options and a few different routes we can actually take. So this arm on the F80 M3 has a rubber bush as standard. This can actually be considered an upgrade in some cases on other BMW platforms. So some BMWs come with bushes like this, like an M140i or an A90 Supra as well, which shares the same suspension bush and assembly. And this is actually an oil-filled bush. So the issues we're discussing with this suspension arm on the F80 is a much larger issue with an oil-filled bush. So this is effectively a bush with a void space, which is filled with oil to allow for even more movement in the actual arm. So this is done for comfort reasons, which we'll touch on shortly, but that means that even just going to rubber can sometimes be an upgrade for a bush like that. However, we need to upgrade beyond rubber. So after rubber, there are two other options on the market: polyurethane and solid bushes. So polyurethane is a stiffer material. It's stiffer than rubber, but it still allows for some movement in the bush. So it's more of a hybrid position in terms of the upgrade. The solid bush, which is our preferred option, replaces the rubber bush with a completely solid unit, allowing for no movement whatsoever, which means that our geometry is going to stay rigid and it's going to stay exactly the same as how we set it, which is going to not only give increased confidence to the driver due to better feedback through the steering wheel, but it's going to give more grip and a more consistent drive due to the same geometry being on the car all the time in all situations and conditions. So you now might be thinking, well, surely the manufacturer is going to optimize their cars and choose these solid bushes for you in the chassis, and they have done to a degree, like the lateral control arms we showed you before. They do have solid bushes, and actually on the M cars in the rear hubs, they also have solid bushes there for that minimal deflection. However, one of their biggest focuses when they're designing these cars is comfort levels. So they do take into account how the car is going to feel on the road, and they do disregard a lot of how the car is going to feel out on track, because a very small percentage of their customers worldwide are going to be using them on track excessively. So when they're designing the car from scratch, they have to consider the road comfort above pretty much everything else, which is why we see so much rubber around the car. When you move over your sights to a more track-focused car from a manufacturer like a GT4 RS from Porsche, that is actually completely monoballed from standard, as is the 992 GT3 RS, completely monoballed as standard. There's no rubber in that suspension assembly. So in this scenario, those cars have been designed for track use, and their focus has been performance, so they've chosen to solid bush them and take away slightly from the comfort on the road. You do need to be careful though when upgrading to solid bushes, because of something called NVH, which is a very common term used in the suspension world, especially when talking about suspension bushes. So NVH stands for noise, vibration and harshness, and it is exactly what it says there in its description. So it basically is a measure for how much noise, vibration and harshness is coming from the road through the chassis to the driver. So this is something you've got to be careful with solid bushes, because if you replace all of your bushes with solid bushes on your car, you'd get a lot of noise, vibration and harshness, similar to a racing car, which is solid bush by nature. So inside a race car, it's very visceral. You feel all the vibration, all the noise is coming through that chassis, and on a road, it would feel awful to drive, and there'd be no comfort whatsoever. So it's very important to select the correct bushes to upgrade to a solid bush, which has the best trade-off possible. So when we're looking at upgrading bushes, instead we look for the performance gain versus the NVH increase trade-off, and that's the way to assess each bush one by one. Rather than just trying to upgrade the whole car at once, you can take a look at each bush in the suspension assembly, see which one offers the biggest performance gain for the littlest NVH increase. Let's take a little look around the car at some examples of the trade-offs between performance gain and NVH. We'll start off with the camber plates. We replaced the OEM strut tops, which have a rubber bush as standard on the F80 M3, with our camber plates which have the solid monoball. This gave a massive performance gain out on track and out on the roads for an extremely minimal increase in NVH. We've actually had our camber plates fitted to this car now for over 15,000 miles of road and track use, and there's still no real noticeable increase in NVH. If anything, there's a very slight amount of road noise just coming through, but that is it. So in terms of a trade-off for the massive amount of performance gain given to the car, for that very, very small increase in NVH, it was well worth that trade-off. So this is a prime example of where upgrading the bush in a suspension assembly system to provide such a massive upgrade is well worth it. On the other end of the scale, a prime example where there's a small increase in performance for a big increase in NVH would be your engine and transmission mounts. So this is an area where you want to reduce the unwanted mass transfer of the engine and transmission assemblies through the corners. So you get a small performance gain by stopping that movement, but the increase in NVH, because of how much vibration physically goes through the engine and transmission, which should be transmitted into the chassis, would be huge. So this is an area where you really have to be almost purely a track car to consider upgrading these engine mounts to stiffer ones, because the trade-off, especially out on the road, really is not worth it. Moving to the rear axle of the F80 M3, there's two different areas we're going to cover back here. One being the diff. So the diff is an area that does offer some performance increase when upgrading the bushes, because especially on the F80 M3, it only utilises a single mounting point at the rear of the diff. So this can allow for quite a lot of rotation on throttle. So it actually has a little bit of a delay on throttle response, because you're hitting the throttle and it's actually trying to rotate the diff first before that power gets translated through the shafts into the wheels. So dual mounting the rear diff can offer quite a lot of performance increase, but doing it with solid bushes would add a lot of NVH as well. So this is a scenario where there's quite a high performance increase, but you also get a high NVH increase. So this is a prime example for a car that's used on the road as well, where poly bushes would come in very, very handy. So in that scenario, you'd get the dual mounting aspect, you'd also get the reduced flex aspect, but you're going to reduce that NVH, because if they were solid, there'd be an awful lot of noise coming through the chassis, whereas the poly bush dampens that sound and actually gives you the performance increase whilst reducing the NVH. So this is a prime example of where poly bushes would be a perfect fit on the car. The other thing we're going to look at is the rear lower control arm bush in the subframe here. So this connects the lower coffin arm of the car to the subframe. At this end in the hub, BMW have already put a solid bush in the hub to reduce the flex as much as possible. So this is the bush that's very commonly upgraded for track into a solid bush, and we make our own as well. This is, however, a bush that would give a good performance increase, but again, a notable increase in MVH. So not a huge increase in MVH, but it would be notable. So we do say to people that you've got to really be using your car almost 50-50 for track use and road use to warrant going to this bush for that trade-off to be in your favour in terms of performance. If it's mainly a road car with the occasional track day, then we wouldn't normally recommend upgrading this bush beyond rubber because of that MVH increase for the performance increase aspect. Looking back at the front suspension assembly, the front control arm or the front thrust arm, the big rubber bush in there is another area that we can improve with a big performance gain for a very minimal increase in MVH by fitting the solid front control arm bush. So this bush being solid removes all of that movement from the front suspension assembly, meaning that the geometry changes aren't going to occur. So we get much more stable braking behavior from the car and much higher levels of grip and stability and better feedback for the driver. So a lot of performance gains for a very, very minimal in terms of noise, vibration and harshness back to the driver. So this makes it a really nice fast road upgrade, and also an upgrade that has huge benefits out on track and out on the roads. It's always important to remember to focus on that performance increase versus MVH increase when you're looking around the car and considering which bushes are best to upgrade first if you're using the car on the road especially. We've got a lot more upgrades coming for this car, and we've also got some tests planned for the front solid control arm bushes. We're currently in the middle of winter here in the UK, so testing is very difficult with the tracks currently closed and the weather is just awful in general, so we can't get any consistent data. So we're going to do the data tests on these bushes further down the road. We're also going to be installing our front offset solid caster bushes and doing some data on these too. So we're really excited to get these fitted and show you the benefits that these offer to the chassis, but we need to wait until we can get back on track in good conditions to really show you the benefits of these bushes. So there you have it. Don't miss out on what's to come. Make sure you subscribe, and we've got a lot more coming your way in terms of data for the F80 M3.